meeting of our seminar, History and Education in Early Modern Philosophy, Spinoza and Beyond. Today we are very pleased to host Julie Klein from Villanova University. Professor Klein has worked extensively on Spinoza's thought, and in particular on Spinoza's conception of education. She has published numerous articles in international journals. We may recall a recent Maimonides and Spinoza on perfection in knowing and affect, 2023, in which she compares the educational perspective of Spinoza and Maimonides, starting from the idea that both envision education as a process of enhancing cognition and shaping the desire to know. Equally interesting is her 2024 article, How to Make a Philosopher, in which Klein examines Spinoza's theological political treatise, The Ethics, and the correspondence in order to clarify his account of philosophical pedagogy. Today, Professor Klein will present a talk entitled The Education of Cognition and Affect. So we are very much looking forward to hear her presentation, so I will now give her the floor.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to have a chance to talk about our favorite philosopher, or at least my favorite philosopher. So I'd like to start by just saying a few things about that are kind of orienting remarks about how I think about reading Spinoza. And then I want to say some things about why education is a good lens for studying Spinoza's philosophy. And then I'll say some things about how he treats education. So as a kind of first orienting remark, my overall aim is to read the Ethics as a whole work related to Spinoza's other major works. So I think of the Ethics as a set of parts that are gathered together or that hang together. The so-called practical parts of the Ethics, say 3 and 4, big chunks of part 5, can neither be separated from nor strictly derived from the so-called more theoretical parts 1 and 2. I think it would be artificial to pull these into discrete pieces. I also think it would be reductive to think that we start in Ethics 1 and then we just derive everything through a kind of deductive machinery that takes us all the way to the end of Ethics 5. Instead, I think it's better to read the parts of the Ethics as reflecting from different vantage points on a series of core problematics. So those problematics would include infinity and determination. So natura naturans and natura naturata, to use the familiar expression from Ethics 1, eternity and time or duration, identity and difference or sameness and difference, action and affection, and so on. Now, some of these differences are aspectival, as in the case of time and eternity, and some of them pertain to attributes, as in the case of thought and extension. And some, I think, might be described in terms of a register. So the register of affective life, it's not exactly an attribute, but it's an important discourse in the Ethics. And I think also that scale is an important part of the discussion. There has been some literature about Spinoza's mereology. Here I'm thinking of the composite character of what he calls res singularis in the 7th definition of Ethics 2. So we can think about the scales of individuals. We might be thinking of somebody we pick out as a person, or we might be thinking of something like the state. And there's been a lot of literature on individuation of late, and in particular on the question of social individuals. And when we read the Ethics this way, I think we can see that as we look at the parts, there are great commonalities, but we have different sets of definitions and axioms to help us conceptualize these core problematics about infinity and determination, about scale, about thought and extension, and activity and passivity, kind of in different domains or different discourses. Now, when we turn to the theme of education, thinking about human development under the attributes of extension and thought is obviously a very prominent issue. Spinoza consistently links the development of a more powerful body to the development of a more powerful mind. This comes up in the Scholium to Proposition 13 in Ethics 2, comes up in Proposition 14 in Ethics 2, comes up in Part 3 and Proposition 11, in Part 4 and Proposition 38, and then in Proposition 39 of Part 5, right at the very end of the ethics. In the seemingly most intellectual part, there's a big discussion of the capacities of the body and the example of the child. Now, in the demonstration in Ethics 4, Proposition 8, Spinoza really underscores the union of ideas, affects, and events and extension. He says that an idea is united to an affect in the same way as the mind is united to the body. That is, as I've shown, he writes in Part 2, Proposition 21 in the Scholium, the idea is not really distinguished from the affect itself, or by the general definition of the affects from the idea of the body's affection. So in other words, the idea is only conceptually distinguished, or I would gloss this perspectively distinct to avoid any kind of idealizing hints of extra layers or any reference to extra entities here. It's just perspectively distinct from the affect. And when we start thinking this way, we tell ourselves, for example, that because Spinoza prohibits cross-attribute causal explanation, we say that the joy that characterizes reasoning isn't an add-on or the result of some kind of magical mind over matter. Rather, human existence can be explained in terms of mental or extended events or in the register of affect. They are, in Spinoza's phrase, one and the same. And it's the activity of reasoning that manifests as joy. So again, reason doesn't rule over affect, but the feeling of activity is a stable, reinforcing joy. And so Spinoza gives us a way of thinking about the characteristic embodiments and affective styles, or the kind of the textures, the ways of living of imaginatively, rationally, and intuitively constituted minds. And I should say here, every mind is a ratio of these different kinds of ideas. No one is exclusively imaginative, exclusively rational, or exclusively intuitive when we are thinking about an actual life. Now, the issue of scale is also really important to reflecting on education. In a way, we can think about the theme of education in Spinoza as falling into three broad categories. First, the education of children or beginners. Second, the cultivation of philosophers. And third, a project of civic education by imaginative and rational means. Nobody lives in perfect isolation. On the contrary, each of us is constituted by and with others. Each of us, for example, carries the traces, the affective traces of parents and others we've encountered, particularly at young, impressionable ages. Spinoza thinks the body, when young, is especially soft, almost unstructured, and takes on impressions. And so the child is very easily takes on the affect of people around it. And so by implication, we're very much shaped by past and ongoing processes of civic education, of other people's personal histories, as well as the idiosyncratic combinations these make in us. The exact causal history of our affects, and so of our corporeal styles and our ultimate cognitive trajectories, can't be reconstructed. That causal tale really exceeds us. And so we're always starting in the middle of things, intervening in processes already underway. We're always involved in structures and patterns that extend beyond us. I think that's a really key point about Spinoza. And various commentators have spoken about the kind of opacity of imagination. It's real, but it can't be fully disentangled by us. So I think also we need to read Spinoza's different texts together. They're obviously written for somewhat different audiences and somewhat different styles, but we can see lots of overlap. We know that parts of the ethics and the TTP were written at the same time. We can go into the letters and see passages that appear in other works. We can do developmental work on Spinoza and start, for example, in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect and go forward. And we can see some really obvious things. For example, the insertion of a kind of mini ethics into the fourth chapter of the theological political treatise. So there are some central preoccupations, I think, in Spinoza, and we can look at them in these different contexts. So with that said, I want to add another kind of piece of basic strategy, which is that I think we ought to read Spinoza's philosophy not just for what it says, but for what it does. There are theoretical propositions, arguments, what you might want to call the semantic or cognitive content of the ethics, but there are also practices or dynamic capacities we acquire. Spinoza writes in the Scholium to Proposition 49 in Ethics 2 that ideas are, he says, not pictures on a panel, rather they're intrinsically affirmative, that is to say, they're powers of thinking. And so I want to say that the text says, but it also does. It trains us to think by following the arguments. We're actually developing capacities. And as we go through the ethics or we go through the theological political treatise, in fact, we're being trained to think, feel, and ultimately act. So to put this kind of another way, as readers, we're undergoing revisionary processes. You could call it therapeutic, you could call it developmental, whatever you want to put in there. But there's a revision and reconfiguration of our ideas and affects, and by implication, our bodies as well. Spinoza is producing readers who do differently. And in thinking about the text as acting on readers, or at least readers who are willing to engage, and that becomes a big issue in reading Spinoza, I see my own work as intersecting with some of the recent work on the medicina mentis and cultura animi traditions. So, for example, Sorana Corneano's wonderful 2011 book, Regimens of the Mind, Boyle, Locke, and the early modern cultura animi tradition, which links to Spinoza via Boyle and Bacon. And of course, there are many, many scholars who, following the path marked out by Pierre Hadot, consider philosophy as a way of life. So I think I'm intersecting with those literatures in asking about education and cultivation and transformation, I think we could say, of readers. There's a sense in which Spinoza is trying to produce readers through these texts. If you follow them as cognitive exercises, you will be rearranged. I think, for early modern readers, we think of Descartes' Meditations this way now. And maybe we haven't thought about the ethics so much in that way, but we can. And plenty of Spinoza scholars see Spinoza as basically eudaimonistic in his outlook. And I think there's something deeply right about that, but they tend to over-intellectualize the account. And so I think we need to kind of move away from an excessively metaphysics and epistemology-driven Spinoza and come a little closer to Spinoza as a philosopher of everyday life. And since I'm an unapologetically naturalizing reader, I see that as a fairly easy move. And I think of my work on pedagogy and education in Spinoza as really being in dialogue with a whole set of contemporary readers who prioritize Spinoza's concern with how we're living. I'm thinking here of Susan James, whose recent collection, Spinoza on Learning and Live Together, on Learning to Live Together, thinks about living not merely with others like us, but with other parts of nature as well, as a kind of signature statement of that position. I think it goes back to Jenny Lloyd's work, Moira Gayton's work, Hassana Sharp. Ursula Rentz is also doing this kind of work. So I think of myself as in that neighborhood of Spinoza scholarship. I think there's also a connection to the folks who've been talking about what a good life is in Spinoza. So Sanam Sayorslan on friendship, Matt Kisner's in that space, Steve Nadler's been writing about the good life. So I think thinking about education and the development of human capacities kind of fits into these larger literatures. And I don't in any way mean to minimize the impact of the systematic metaphysics of Ethics 1 or the deep reflections on cognition in Ethics 2. I myself have written a lot about this. But I do think in many ways a lot of the ethics is not really about substance per se, it's about modes. It's res singularis among themselves, right? Finite determinate things, they're how I would put this, the ways nature occurs, right? The modes. And their deeply interconnected, interdependent character are really the primary object of a lot of the ethics. And of course, that's very much true of the political works. Now, I want to say it's very tricky to talk about human life. In Spinoza, we all talk about this, but in the very next breath, we admit that there's an unmistakably anti-humanistic kind of decentering tenor of Spinoza's discussions of human life. And I should say here, Ursula Rentz and some colleagues have a new anthology coming out about the human form in Spinoza. And I have an essay in there, and there's lots of good stuff in that volume. That I think will be enriching for all of us who are interested in education. Any human being obviously is a part of nature whose laws extend universally and reflect no particular concern for human beings. And so Spinoza is always regularly, consistently, constantly inviting us to think beyond the human perspective, right? What's the appendix to Ethics 1 except a kind of stunning rebuke to all anthropocentric, kind of narcissistic, projective ways of thinking about human beings. Again, think also of the end of Ethics 4. It's a very clear statement of what it means to be a small power in a much bigger nature. So without taking up any discourses of humanism or personalism or things like that, Spinoza is really interested in human bodies, human minds, human affects, and human communities and their encounters with like and unlike things. Quite strikingly, there's not a definition of human nature. There's a model of human nature that's supposed to be useful to us. And there's not a lot of talk about the human essence. As I read Ethics 3 and 4, the central question is really about human interactions. Let me say this again. The central question in thinking about human interactions is what it means to be res similares, similar things, with some points of some commonality and some difference, having enough to join together and increase our power to persevere in existing, having enough difference to make that kind of full of friction. And navigating that, I think, is a major topic. So I recently discovered, and I wish I had found this earlier, a wonderful 2017 paper by Chantal Jacquet called From the Self to Oneself, that I'm happy to, I'll send you the PDF. And she, this is in 2017, and I myself have been writing on topics like this since then, so I really wish I had discovered this earlier. She emphasizes the distinction between selfhood on the one hand and personal subjectivity on the other. And Jacquet writes, quote, "There's no me in the work of Spinoza, but only a self. And here's what she says to explain the difference. She says, in contrast to the me, which is inseparable from an irreducible intimacy of a particular experience and of a personal subject, enclosed in an unshakable inner fortress, the self limits the access to an interior distinguishable from all others, more than it limits the access to a reflected consciousness that may very well be mine, yours, or of anyone else. The self introduces impersonal distance, and it expands the dimension of the subject by including the possibility of weakening it in all forms, you, me, them, and us, without privileging any of them. The passage from the I to the self shakes the classical representation of the mediating subject and invites us to rethink afresh the categories of the interior and the exterior. So what she's getting at, right, is the demolition of Augustinian Cartesian subjects in Spinoza's philosophy. And she's saying if you track the discussions of self, it enables you to formulate a much more porous, connected sense of self, and then to ask about those entanglements with other things and to have a more kind of socially constituted idea of the self. So rather than prioritizing some special, personalized interior, you see the interconnection, right? And where the old theory treated those interconnections as a kind of artificial exterior, the new and improved theory with Spinoza allows us to treat those as constitutive. And I think that's a really helpful way of framing it, right? From the Spinozan perspective, it's hard to separate the interior and the exterior. We know to act is to have been affected, and we know that affections have consequences. So if we try to disentangle that in terms of, well, activity over here and passivity over there, or the exterior over here and the interior over there, Spinoza just doesn't let us do that. It's a much more complicated and fluid and multiplicitous situation. To be a mode is to be in constant communication and exchange with other modes, and modes leave marks, so to speak, on one another. Think about, for example, postulate 6 in Ethics 2, which says that the human body can move external bodies and dispose them in a variety of ways. So we are shaped by and we shape our ambient others in a very complex causal network. And when our encounters give rise to adequate ideas, well, then our power increases. So, for example, this is from the Scholium to Proposition 42 in Ethics 5. Spinoza says that the wise person, insofar as he's considered as such, so precisely as wise, is hardly troubled in spirit, but being by a certain eternal necessity conscious of himself and of God and of things, he never ceases to be, but always possesses true peace of mind. So the wise person is conscious of himself, of God, and of things. Right? This is hardly a closed interior space, right? This is imminent participation in a much wider network. And in that sense, nothing is foreign, nothing is radically alien or radically external to the wise person, right? The wise person is experiencing what Spinoza calls in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, the union of the mind with the whole of nature. Right? To be a wise self is to know one's immanent connection with everything else, and so precisely to break down any ideas of my interiority and replace them with the idea of the self as being in and with others as expressions of the infinite power of nature. And I myself struggled to find ways to formulate this in an essay on life and death in Spinoza's philosophy, and Jacquet was there. So it's a great lesson in searching as widely as we can in the literature, and then being surprised by things we didn't discover in our searches, and being wonderfully enlightened by just the sheer number of smart people working on Spinoza and saying things that we ought to pay a lot of attention to. So in saying nothing's foreign or alien or radically external to the wise person, in a way it's to channel Terence, right? That nothing human is alien to me. And Spinoza obviously knew his Terence, and he could have, Seneca mentions this expression in a letter. We know that Spinoza studying with Van Enden had the students performing Terence's comedies and Seneca's tragedies. We know Spinoza had a really good grip on a lot of Roman literature. Um, so we could go in that direction, and there's a fascinating literature of Spinoza on Stoicism. But I want to go into another corner of Spinoza's library, which is the Hebrew corner of Spinoza's library. And we know, for example, which copy of the Guide of the Perplexed he had, and we know some things about what was about preaching in Amsterdam, about texts that were in circulation. We know about various connections. And Spinoza, like a lot of authors, doesn't tell us exactly what he was reading, but we can find textual parallels and the like. So we know he had Maimonides, and we know he knew Gersonides. And there are hints of Leone Hebreo, and now we're starting to look at more Averroistic sources. There was just a conference in Paris on Islamic sources and Spinoza. That's coming, some of those essays are coming out in Les Études Philosophiques. Laurence Renaud organized that. So this is a kind of growing area. For my purposes, the big advantage of looking at somebody like Maimonides or somebody like Gersonides is, number one, that they reflect explicitly on the process of education. They're super interested in the impact of prejudice, and that's a topic Spinoza is super interested in. And they're also really interested in the relationship between discursive rational knowing and intuitive knowing. And it's much harder to describe that, but they have some things to say about that. In reflecting on processes of education, they're as interested in the affective as the cognitive dimensions of education. Prejudice turns out to be an imaginative idea that has a huge affective reach. It's entrenched, it's obstructive. We're satisfied by it, we stick to it, and we don't let go of it. And when we learn new things that conflict with our kind of preconceived opinions, to use a more Cartesian phrase, we resist. So they're very interested in that and the kind of deformations that can be wrought in thinking by those phenomena. And they're really interested in the desire to know, and they treat desire and knowledge as two sides of the same coin. They don't have a theory of the will in the kind of Pauline Augustinian sense of a rational faculty that mediates between desire on the one hand and cognition on the other hand, or the mind and the body. So this kind of third element is absent. And we can see that each of them theorizes something like what Spinoza will come to call the eternity of the mind. And when we go there, one of the, we're seeing something like basically Aristotelian noetic union. And what you see is a theory of degrees of participation in universal intelligibility. You don't see a theory of the immortality of metaphysically individual souls who get their fate in an afterlife. And so Steve Nadler and others, I've been in this literature, have talked about the parallels between Maimonides, Gersonides on intellectual immortality and Spinoza. For our purposes, it's really the identity of the mind with its ideas that's important, and the absence of a mediating will. So we can say desire and knowledge are two sides of the same coin, not different faculties or powers of a human being. So let's talk a little bit about pedagogy. So the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, that's the most obviously pedagogical text in Spinoza, and it's been treated a lot. Johann Dahlbeck talks about it. Maxime Rovere has a lovely article that talks about it. And in little snippets, Spinoza envisions a kind of ideal education which would lead students directly to understanding nature and, crucially, to forming a society that sustains and imparts that knowledge and is a well-functioning social group. So from the very beginning in Spinoza, the treatise on the emendation of the intellect also has this vision of a good social life that's associated with intellectual progress. He tells us, if you look in sections 14 and 15, that we have to train children's rational abilities, but also their desires. The ideal learner would be free from base desires for all the false things like wealth, honor, and sensual pleasure, and free from prejudice. He says in paragraphs 45 and 44 and 45 of the treatise that prejudice is the reason human beings fail to investigate nature in the proper order. If only we could so investigate nature, well, then everything would flow to us of its own accord. And interestingly, Spinoza says in that same discussion of prejudice that it's a huge obstacle to learning, but there are some others as well. To learn, we need, he says, a considerable capacity for making accurate distinctions. And we also need to apply much effort. There has to be a kind of commitment, patience, diligence for us to learn. He lists the instabilities of human affairs and a couple other factors he says he'll discuss later. And if you look, for example, at letter 9, and this has been discussed by Dobbs Weinstein in the literature, you can see Spinoza talking about De Vries, a promising student, and worrying that his impetuousness and his impatience, what you could call a sort of unruly desire to know, will actually sabotage his development. You could think about Van Blyenberg's decision to submit the results of intellect to the authority of the Bible, right, as a way in which prejudice and a kind of submission to authority undermine development. You could think of Spinoza's late correspondence with his former student Berg, who exhibits, I would say, a remarkable aggression and closed-mindedness, right? Like you can see there's not a lot of learning going on in that correspondence. These are really examples of affect getting in the way. And so it's useful to think about prejudice in terms of its kind of emotional power. It's that, no, it can't be, or that violates my ideas. Prejudices are imaginative ideas that have gotten particularly stuck in the mind. They are ingrained, entrenched. We are attached to them. We're satisfied by them. That's the word in the E1 appendix. And prejudices aren't add-ons to the mind, they're organizations of our thinking. And they deprive us of patience, of flexibility, of movement. So you could think of prejudice as getting stuck, and Spinozan therapy is a kind of unsticking and getting the mind moving again, restoring some ability to think otherwise. Now, if you think about the ethics in a kind of pedagogical frame, it really turns on how we can move from imagining, which is a way of thinking and a form of living characterized by inadequate ideas and passive affects, to reasoning and intuitive understanding, which consist of adequate ideas and active affects. And again, you see this coupling of ideas and affects. We need correctly ordered desire, and we need to cultivate the student's power to understand causal connections. So the successful Spinozan student, right, who goes through the process, say, of reading the Appendix to Ethics 1, is enabled to displace the authority, right, the internalized authority, the external authority of previously acquired prejudices, literally praejudicia, prejudgments, that obstruct or even forbid reasoning, and to develop a patient and careful practice of reconsidering imaginative ideas, right? Taking those confused things that Spinoza calls conclusions without premises and sorting them, right? To see differences, oppositions, relations, to do the work that's described, for example, in the scholium to proposition 29 of Ethics 2, proto-rational activity, and then to find common notions and to use those as the foundations of our reasoning. So there's a kind of first transition from prejudiced imagination to a more fluid imagination that's compatible with the emergence of reasoning. And then there's a second transition from reason to intuitive knowing. So let's just talk a little bit about what happens once prejudice is released and once we start reasoning. And you just, by the way, you can see Spinoza bringing up the impact of prejudice at various points in the ethics. It's in the appendix to Ethics 1. It comes up again in Ethics 2. He's very aware that these things are very sticky. And a lot of what he says is a dramatic rethinking of common ideas or philosophy we've inherited. So of course we're going to bristle. And of course it's going to be difficult to think differently. But as we really work through the demonstrations and even the less formal arguments in the scholia, what we're doing is coming to understand, and this is the language from the scholium of 2P29, the agreements, disagreements, and oppositions of things. We learn to attend more closely to the causal network of nature, and we begin to see things in relation to the first cause. So we're shifting from thinking in terms of images to thinking in terms of causal relations, and we are in effect working the mental muscles of doing that. We are building capacity. The mind comes to be constituted more by dynamic appreciation of the causal happening of nature. At the same time, the activity of reasoning produces more joyful affect, right? And gives us a kind of forward motion, and enables us better to persevere in existing, and so ultimately to flourish, right? Spinoza thinks of reason as a kind of self-increasing virtuous spiral. So with appropriate training and cultivation, a human mind that's always at first constituted preponderantly by imaginative ideas and passivity can become a mind in which rational ideas and activity predominate. And Spinoza talks about this very concisely in the scholium to proposition 4 in Ethics 5 and the scholium to proposition 20 in Ethics 5. And it's this development that can lead to the desire for scientia intuitiva, right? In Ethics 5, proposition 28, where, if we achieve it, we would apprehend singular things as immanent expressions of the first cause. And again, we can talk about this in terms of cognition, but it's the affective transition, right? And the ability to persevere in existing. All of this is happening at the same time. As human beings with minds, we like to go mind first, but we could tell the story from different vantage points. Now, if you think about the TTP is addressed to readers who have the capacity to engage the arguments. In fact, at the end of the preface, Spinoza says, well, if you're not, the kind of reader who can do this, please close the book and put it down. Nothing good can come from this. Right? He says, for readers who would philosophize more freely if they weren't prevented by the thought that reason ought to be the handmaid of theology, well, he says, well, I'm confident I have a lot to offer you, right? Follow me, I will retrain your mind, and all of a sudden you'll be thinking, wait a second, you'll have a whole different view of the Bible. But if you're too mired in prejudice and you don't have the patience to read this book, put it down. It'll be a disaster. And you can see in the TTP that Spinoza is making really the same kinds of arguments about the best life. Think about the core arguments of the fourth chapter, right, about intellectual love of God, nothing can be or be conceived without God, right? Knowledge of God has to be drawn from common notions and built up in a rational way, right? This is all about transitioning from a kind of not only prejudiced, but merely imaginative appreciation of the world to understanding what's universal or common to all men, aiming at the supreme good, namely true knowledge and love of God. Um, right? This is kind of a mini ethics. Now, the great thing about the TTP is that it has a lot to say about the transition from imagination to reason. So in TTP 5, we find Spinoza expanding on that little snippet from the emendation of the intellect, where he says, to acquire reason, you need a lot of hard work. You need some ability and you need effort. So TTP 5 extols the power of teaching and learning via deductions, he says, from intellectual axioms known through themselves. And then he explains that means solely by the power of the intellect and its order in perceiving. But he immediately notes that only a few people will have the ability and temperament to do this. He says, because deducing a thing solely from intellectual notions very often requires a long chain of perceptions plus extreme caution, mental perceptiveness, and restraint, all of which are rarely found in human beings would rather be taught by experience than deduce all of their perceptions from a few axioms and connect them together. While someone who follows a prophet's direction may live according to the guidance of reason and so end up living the life of justice and charity, it's only the person who actually perceives God's existence intellectually and affirms justice and charity rationally is more blessed. But the point here is that that long chain of perceptions and deductions, all the work of reasoning, requires caution and restraint, right? It's a question of one's affective temperament, as well as a kind of perceptiveness or mental acuity, a kind of acumen for philosophy. And Spinoza says in the TTP, right, if you follow my method for reading scripture, it'll pry you apart from claims that reflect merely your imaginative perceptions of the world or external authorities, and you'll start reading in a whole different way. Follow me through the chapters. If you don't have the patience and the moderation and the restraint and the discipline to tolerate the chapters, well, then you won't reach the end. There's a great passage in TTP 13 where Spinoza says, somebody might say, it's not necessary to understand God's attributes, but it's quite necessary to believe in them simply without any demonstration. But anyone who says this is talking nonsense. Invisible things and those which are the objects only of the mind can't be seen by any other eyes than by demonstrations. Someone who doesn't have demonstrations doesn't see anything at all in these things. If they repeat what they've heard about them, it no more touches or shows their mind than do the words of a parrot or an automaton, which speaks without a mind or without meaning. And in this sense, the TGV is many, many things, but like the ethics, it's really concerned with, and this is the phrase from the Scholium to Proposition 23 in Ethics 5, demonstrations as the eyes of the mind, right, with a new way of coming to see. And if we had more time, we could talk about TTP 7 and the sketch of scientific method. But when you look at this combination of needing the right desire and needing the right cognitive training, this looks a lot like the beginning of the Guide of the Perplexed. And if you look at what Maimonides says about his student Joseph, the addressee of the guide, it's all these same worries that poor training has put people off on the wrong foot and sent them down the wrong path. They need remedial training, and they need to go through a series of sciences from logic through natural science all the way up to metaphysics to reconstitute the mind and train the inferential abilities, right? To take what was a mainly imaginative mind and make it a more rational power. And when you look in Guide of the Perplexed, Part 1, Chapter 34, you see you see Maimonides saying basically, everybody wants to know, but nobody wants to do the work. He says literally that most people find the path of schooling from logic to math through all the sciences, they find it, he says, tedious. It's boring. It's hard work. And he says, everybody wants to understand the heavens and know how the world was created, but basically nobody wants to do the work. Everyone has a natural desire to know things as they are in truth, yet even the prospect of a solid week of study, let alone, he says, the need for many premises and a long time for investigation, well, that's just repellent to most people. And when you read this, it's like reading a preview of Spinoza. And Maimonides says, look, this is the only way to know anything about God is precisely to go through this whole training. There isn't another way. We need to train the mind, he says in chapter 34, part 1 of the guide. Train the mind and procure for it the habitus of drawing inferences and knowledge of the truth. And if you don't go through the prerequisites, you end up in perverse opinions and doom. But it's that idea of procuring a habitus, training the mind, making the affect support the rational training, and then the affect of reason is a further desire to know. So there's a kind of issue of getting that on the right track, and then letting the natural desire to know, an appropriately formed. It's a natural desire that needs appropriate formation that will then take it and run. So you see a kind of similar thing in Gersonides, and I realize we're running out of time, so I maybe just kind of describe this to you. Gersonides writes a sort of letter to the reader, you might say, at the beginning of the Wars of the Lord, and he sets out 7 methodological kind of instructions. And he complains a lot about Maimonides. If you know the Guide of the Perplexed, it's not a very linear book. It's extremely hard to read. Maimonides says, in fact, I deliberately made it confusing and hard to read so that you, the reader, would really have to work for the insight. The book, it's not a textbook at all. It has parables, it has contradictions, it's obscure. Sometimes Maimonides says things like, the intelligent reader will understand me here. So it's really designed to resist mimetic appropriation, and it's like I'm an anti-textbook, and to be able to read me, you're going to have to work hard and really cultivate capacities. And only the people who can follow that work to the end will get the insights. So Gersonides is a little aggravated by that kind of method. Aaron Garrett has a lovely chapter in which he discusses this. He has a book, Spinoza on Meaning and Method, where this comes up. But Gersonides also has this very long description of what you should do when you're trying to teach ideas which the reader finds strange because they're at odds with what he was brought up to believe. And Gersonides talks about how to kind of pry that reader loose and kind of gradually get that person to see and be more open to the ideas so that the prior formation will not be an obstacle to obtaining the truth of the matter. Right. So there's this kind of exquisite concern with reconfiguration or re-education as the beginning, and it's the resistance, right? It's not only that I can't think certain things because my mind is going in other directions, but it's also that I don't want to. That that can't be right. It's the impatience, it's the dismissal. And again, these are desiderative affective states, and cognitive states of my mind literally can't go there. I can't form the idea or I can't follow the logic. So all of them have this kind of deep concern with the transition from imagination to reason, with reconfiguration. And then I think you can also kind of look at this other transition from reason to intellection, right? And Spinoza has a lot less to say about that, right? 5p28 says from the second kind of knowledge, the desire for the third kind of knowledge can arise. And we have a whole literature, right, of the difference between reason and intellect, but there's something very hard to explain in the transition from seeing a lot of connections to, Spinoza says, seeing and also feeling the belonging of things with the first cause. If you look at those texts in the Scholium to Ethics 5, Proposition 29, and also in the Scholium to Proposition 36 of Ethics 5, Spinoza says that what characterizes intuitive knowing is a feeling of participation. It's an experience of being part of the power of nature. So there's something about reasoning that enables us to see it, and there's something in intuitive knowing that's a felt experience. And there's a kind of affective transformation, right, named by intellectual love. But it's hard to explain how we get there. And if you look to the parallels in Maimonides and Gersonides, it's also difficult to explain what happens in that kind of shift in thinking and feeling. In Maimonides, in the end of the guide, there's a lot of description about what it's like once you're there, but it's hard to say how it happens. So that's that second transition. And maybe we can talk about that. Maybe you have more ideas about that, and we could look at some texts together. The last thing I want to say is that we shouldn't divorce all of these considerations about training readers or individuals from Spinoza's thoughts about civic education. And again, there's been some discussion in the literature about this. Susan James has written about this. Mons Lerka has written about this, others as well. I've written about this. Remember, Spinoza, channeling Machiavelli and echoing Hobbes, argues in chapter 5 of the Political Treatise that human beings aren't born civil, they become civil. And so becoming civil, well, that's a process, and that requires education. And so the apparatus of producing citizens, right, the imaginative apparatus of images, stories, authoritative norms, laws, all of that shapes practice, shapes affect, as much as any cognitive training in education, how to do math, how to reason, so on and so forth. And something else I think to think about here is that Spinoza argues that minds are more persuaded by nobility than by force. Soft power works better than hard power. It's better to get there first with the formative institutions and images and messages. It's better to educate for reason than to have to deal with the consequences. Inevitably, one deals with the consequences of failure. And it's very hard to devise a perfect program of civic education. But a civic training that reduces conflict, that enables people to live more peacefully together, right? That teaches a kind of forbearance and tolerance, or zones of non-coercion. This is ultimately going to work better. And so the boundaries of what we might think of as narrowly education and something like civic shaping, well, that's really, really porous. And that's another way that Spinoza echoes somebody like Maimonides in particular, coming out of the political sensibilities of Plato and Al-Farabi. There's soul shaping and there's city shaping, right? Think about the analogies of the soul and the city in Plato. That's really developed in Farabi, and that's pretty well developed in Maimonides in the account of Moses. And there are some strong echoes of that in Spinoza's account of Moses as a civic shaper. For Maimonides, Moses has an intellectual prophecy. For Spinoza, Moses has no intellectual content at all, right? He's a kind of imaginative, practical genius, but that really has its limits because, of course, Mosaic Commonwealth fails ultimately. But that same concern for something that we might want to call trans-individual, right, or social subjectivity or reciprocal constitution and interdependence, we have to think about that as well when we think about education. It's kind of connecting psychology and politics. So it's really best to try to hold these things together rather than to pull them apart. And so these are some reasons, just to kind of sum it up, that I think it's useful to look at use education as a lens for Spinoza's philosophy, and let him show us some things about the relationship of affect and knowing. Let him show us some things about how that plays out in embodiments and in political actions. If we think about the affective entrenchments on the one hand, and sometimes the instabilities of imaginative life on the other hand, we can see that's not politics we really want to live in. A more rational politics is more joyful and more stable. Just as for Spinoza, a more rational life for any of us is more joyful and more stably so. So those are, for me, some ways of kind of getting to it. And let me stop because I really would like to hear from you.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you for this really nice and thoughtful talk. And also because I really know very little about Maimonides and Gersonides. So thank you for this travel you made from the beginning to these two authors that personally I don't know very well. I don't know if there are any questions. If not, I have one, of course.
Yeah, I
But
have a
let's
question,
see.
but Marta, please start.
Start?
Yeah.
Okay. So I really appreciate your talk, and I'm very much in agreement with the core position you started with, so that the self is something as more trans-individual than something which is closed in its definition. And then you quoted for very different reasons, actually, Gatens, Lloyd, Sharp. But this nonetheless made me wonder about a related issue. Why do you think Spinoza seems to exclude women from the possibility of full education? Or does he not, in fact, exclude them? And if not, how should we interpret the final pages of Political Treatise? So I was thinking, are his remarks prejudicial? That same prejudice that sticks, that affective prejudice that sticks, or there's another possibility which came to my mind, and is it's because given this relationship between the affect and cognition, following the same prejudice, women are too emotional. You know, I was thinking about that passage. I don't remember where it is, of the where Spinoza talks about the tears of women.
That's the vegetarianism passage.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So that what it made me think about these issues. I know you didn't focus on that, but it was a curiosity of mine.
So let me, it's one of those like notorious Spinoza questions, right? And Hassana Sharp, writes about the black page, of the TTP, and she has a wonderful article on this that came out in the Journal of the History of Philosophy, I think. So I think we can say a couple of things. It wouldn't be a great surprise to learn that Spinoza held some of the prejudices of his age, right? We needn't treat him as Saint Spinoza. We need to treat him as a resource for thinking. So if he says some prejudicial things, well, maybe there are other resources in his philosophy for working against that. And we might also say, well, why is Spinoza worried about giving political voice to women? Maybe it's a sociological observation that they're not fully independent, economically or otherwise. And so, in effect, you're giving a second vote to the male head of the household, right? So it could be Spinoza thinking in a very particular perspective. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us exactly what the reason is. And there's that obnoxious passage about the womanish tears, as if only women cry, or somehow women's tears are particularly terrible. So it's hard to say what's going on there. But I think when we read historical authors, we're going to find things that offend us. This is just a fact. The bigger question is, I guess questions are, do we see that as something really integral to the core of the philosophy? Right? Could it be safely excised, and might we go on with our thinking? Just admit, well, yes, that's there. We don't have to like expurgate the text or something. I'm not going to publish the sanitized version of Spinoza's philosophy. But we could also say, well, yes, he says that, but are there other resources? For example, where he says that human nature is always and everywhere the same. Or he carefully analyzes power dynamics, right? We can look at all the examples in the TTP and the TP and try to understand what might be going on here. A parallel issue, and this is really been taken up by a few commentators. Willy Goetschel has written about Spinoza and slavery, and Hassana Sharp has a book on Spinoza and slavery coming out. And if you might think, well, Spinoza says nasty things about women, and he's weirdly silent about the slave trade, which is all over the place in his life. So should we think that Spinoza was pro-slavery? Should we be, probably not. Should we be really troubled by the absence of open discussion of slavery? Well, that's a problem in a lot of the early modern authors we read, at least the canonical ones. I mean, there's a lot of work being done to uncover other texts. And should we think, well, even if we don't judge him favorably on these issues, on something like misogyny or slavery, are there resources in the philosophy to push in a different direction? Right? Are there, we might be very frustrated by the allusions to the involuntary servitude debate in TTP, I guess 16, 17, and we might be kind of banging our heads against the desk thinking involuntary servitude, we know exactly what that means in this period. Why isn't he talking about it? Still, there are reflections on the incompressible kind of minimum of judgment that each of us reserves to ourselves. There are reflections on governance without violence. There are many, many things that we could mobilize for a better politics. So I think we just have to live with our ambivalence and be realistic about it. This is, and I think in general, we ought to be cautious about being too Whiggish on these matters. I mean, what will people think of us? How will the future judge us? So best to be cautious on that, I would say. What's your view? How would you answer that question?
Actually, I completely agree with you on everything you said. I was just wondering when I made you this question if maybe because there are scholars who did it try to find an explanation to this affirmation of Spinoza, not to justify it or to condemn it, neither, but just to explain how did he get to it. I don't know if then if we can stay. I mean, we can of course accept Spinoza for what he wrote, and then look if there are other things that can interest us and push us to think, or also to change things that we don't like. But my question it was really just to know if in the relationship between affect and cognition, you have thought also about this issue. That was the question, actually.
Yeah, I guess I do think of it more in terms of that kind of Republican theme of being more or less in charge of oneself. Mainly. I think also, we can look around in this period, right, at what our favorite canonical philosophers say or do with women, like there are the correspondences of Descartes and Elizabeth and, other examples like this. And, there are highly privileged women who are, tremendous philosophers in their own right. I think we probably have more to do as philosophers in thinking through these social contexts and understanding a little more clearly what's going on. I think just social history would help us. I think also the debates about women in radical religious movements, because we know Spinoza has connections to that. My guess is that there's just more to learn here. And so I myself try to read out into these literatures to get a wider perspective. But I'm not a scholar of any of those things.
May I pose my question briefly?
Please.
Okay. First of all, forgive me, Julie. My laptop camera just broke, so I leave Spinoza's rose as the background for my question. And
you're a disembodied voice.
Thank you very much for your very interesting speech talk. I find it particularly interesting that you take the very concept of activity and passivity as the starting point for ethics, and then link it directly to the question on education. You used an expression that I find very fitting, very apt, the opacity of the imagination. And I think it expresses very well the stratification of context needed to understand the question of imagination in Spinoza. After all, as you said earlier, ethics is more about modes than substance. As someone who teaches and lives in a Catholic context, where I guess education plays a very important role, do you think that today we can conceive of education without models, without Spinoza's exemplar, as Spinoza probably taught? Because I think that the problem is exactly what we find set out in Susan James or in Chantal Jacquet. In Spinoza, there is no separation between one individual self and another in terms of essence. And I think, I don't know if you agree, that the challenge today is precisely to conceive of an education that does not stress out the superiority or the transcendence of the teacher over the learner. It is the level of Averroistic ontology, which you mentioned earlier, that is beginning to influence education as well. So sorry for being so long-winded. I leave it to you now.
Oh, not at all. I really appreciate the question. I think maybe there are two issues. One is that, just to speak a little bit about the opacity of imagination, Spinoza says imagination is confused because bodies have a finite capacity. They absorb imprints and the imprints get all jumbled up. So there's always, to be confused or literally fused together, amalgamated. So it's in principle, right, there's an intelligible causal history of those things, but it's not accessible to us because of the way it registers. And also because all the people we interact with are bringing their histories. And, we're inheriting that too. And we're projecting that out. And so just the causal history here is enormously complicated. It's not something we can disentangle for ourselves. It's intelligible in principle, but really not to us. So that's maybe one thing. Now, the question of models, I think, is really, really interesting. Spinoza says in the preface to Ethics 4 that we can make a model for ourselves and use it as a kind of a teaching device, I think. Right? And kind of, this is what the rational person or the free person would be like. How close can we get to that? And if you think about, for example, is it, I'm just cracking open my ethics here so that I get it right. Is it in part 4, proposition, I always get this wrong, so I'm going to check. 68, right, says, if men were born free, they would form no concept of good and evil so long as they remained free, right? They wouldn't have these imaginative categories. They would just reason. And right, the demonstration says, I call him free, who's led by reason alone, and so on and so forth. And then you come to the scholium, and it says, the hypothesis of this proposition is false, right? This never happens. No one is born free. And if you go through the text, does anyone ever become perfectly free? Well, the answer to that is also no. And one bit of evidence, that should remind us of the impossibility of perfect freedom or even perfect intellectual love in Ethics 5 is that even as we're talking about rational intellectual freedom, Spinoza is always reminding us to have some practical maxims and images ready to hand so that when we kind of fall off track or are stressed out or faltering, we can kind of summon them up and get ourselves back on the right track. So, even for the most rational and intellectual people, the image still has a use, right? We still find ourselves kind of back in imaginative life. So the model, right, is designed to help us move toward becoming more rational. And when our reasoning, as we become more and more rational, well, when we are cast back into imagining, right, because some bigger force is pushing us around, well, then we need this model to sort of set before ourselves as a goal. Now, I also think it's true that the model is not a model of a kind of isolated, metaphysically separate, independent subject, right? The model helps us conceptualize an interdependent existence. In fact, if you think about Ethics 4, it starts with this model of, this human being, and it develops lots of ideas for how I might function, but Ethics 4 is chiefly about the social space. Right? You can't actually talk about wise individuals without talking about all of these social constitutions in which they exist. And Spinoza will tell you things like, the wise person should avoid all the kind of the flatterers, and should kind of stay away from the ignorant and difficult as much as possible. But in a pinch, human beings need other human beings. Right? There's nothing better for a human being than another human being. And we do have a kind of responsiveness and interconnection. So for sure, the model of human nature becomes a kind of social model. So that's maybe the second thing. And like you, I think that literature about interdependence and sociality is so important. I think also the relational autonomy people are kind of in that space. There are sort of different idioms for this: social subjectivity, interdependence, relational autonomy, transindividuation. I think these are frameworks that are grappling with some of the same phenomena from, just slightly different theoretical outlooks, different languages. They emphasize different things, but you can see that they have a kind of common general interest. The last part of what you said about hierarchy, that's a really interesting issue. On the one hand, all human nature is everywhere and always the same, right? And Spinoza certainly doesn't think there are kind of natural hierarchies of people. On the other hand, he does not really want the world to be run by the ignorant. Right? If you live in a society that's run on the basis of imagination alone, it tends to lead toward conflict. And if you think about some of those propositions in the 30s in part 4, insofar as people imagine, they disagree. Insofar as people reason, they come into agreement. If you think about proposition, I think it's 27 in part 3, ambitious people want everyone to live just as they do. Right? They imagine themselves as the sole standard for everything, and everybody should live like me. And Spinoza says in the Scholium, and when everyone thinks like that, they all hate each other. So it's, so the living merely according to, what in the TTP he talks about as kind of untrained appetite, or what he talks about in the Ethics as imagination, this is going to be a life of a lot of conflict. It's going to work sometimes, somehow, for some period, and then it's going to descend. And the goal of a more rationally organized society is to maximize the common and the agreeable, to create a broad enough agreement that it's durable. So that's not exactly a a vision of hierarchy or inequality, but it is a vision of better and worse ways to live. And when you think about a classroom and people learning from one another, right? Spinoza certainly envisions a society in which people can interact and learn from one another. But you know, there is also, I think, some sense of, we use a really modern word, expertise, right? And there is, I think he is arguing there really are better and worse ways of life. And so in a classroom, right, each of us teaches. I don't, you know, from a Spinozistic perspective, I mean, I don't think we view ourselves as better than the students. We might view ourselves as farther along the rational journey, generally speaking, right? More years of training, or we've spent more time reflecting on the material that we're teaching. I mean, a great thing about philosophy is anybody can have a good idea, and that way it's very democratic. But there is a role for technique, for teaching inferential patterns, for focusing people's attention, you know, for a kind of cultivation. So, and I think, I mean, I think it's possible to conceptualize that without, you know, kind of reverting to old authoritarian models of, you know, education, and without invoking kind of like all the language of obedience and submission, right? I mean, Spinoza, as a political philosopher, sometimes uses a Latin word like, you know, subditus, submitted, subjected. Um, but this is generally not the preferred path, right? What you want is consent. You want people to join for positive reasons more than to be coerced into doing something. At the, you know, in the outlying cases, yes, there's a place for force and coercion. You're aiming at attraction and cultivation rather than compulsion, right? Because people, you know, think about TTP5, people are just allergic to being forced to do things. So when we talk about, you know, leadership or teaching or training, I think, you know, thinking with Spinoza, we want to free it from all that authoritarian baggage. And we certainly don't want to have classrooms where the students feel that they just need to repeat what the teacher said, because that's just imaginative, right? That's being a parrot, to use Spinoza's words, and that's not the goal.
Yeah, of course, it's exactly what I intended to say before, because Spinoza seems to abandon the concept of exemplar in the TP in favor of a more contextual vision, closer to Machiavelli and less to his Aristotelian Jewish roots. Obviously, I agree with you that stricto sensu moral maxims and hierarchical models are always present in Spinoza, as we can see in the TTP. In TTP 17, the figure of Moses is pivotal. But perhaps we could get rid of it, of this hierarchical models because of education. But of course, I don't know. Maybe perhaps is no longer Spinoza, is too modern Spinoza. Is not the historic Spinoza, but maybe we can start from this Spinozistic idea of a common ground of influence on one another.
Yeah, when you look, it's so interesting. When you look at how Spinoza describes political leadership, um, it it looks a lot like teaching in some ways. And I'm happy to send you by email some essays where I've written about this. But just as an example, if you look in the appendix to Ethics 4, in sections 12 and 13 and 14, he's actually talking about political leadership, and that's where he says minds are conquered not by weapons but by love and nobility. And he explains that the statesman, right, the political artisan who would bind people together to make unity from diversity requires, he says, a kind of singular mental power, and this is what he says, to bear with each one according to his character, and to refrain from imitating other people's antisocial passions. Above all else, the wise political artisan must, and this is Spinoza, refrain from actions that break men's minds rather than strengthen them. And he goes on to say it's more effective to teach virtue than to castigate vice. And it's to succeed in politics, you have to be able to work with the common passions of envy, vengeance, and self-concern. He says calmly. And you have to work at bringing people together in harmony and friendship. I mean, it's all kind of about discernment and flexible interventions that get people moving in the right direction, rather than prohibitions, domination, threats, and all of that. There's, like, to be a successful politician, it's in many ways a lot like being a successful teacher. It requires discernment of what the person in front of you needs and efforts to move them from here to there. And to do it in a way that is friendly, that is beneficent rather than destructive, that has a vision of human community. In the TTP, Mullins-Lerche makes a lot of this in his book on Spinoza and the Freedom to Philosophize. There's this idea of how the Christian apostles give brotherly advice. This fraternal advice is to be friendly and educational. It's precisely the opposite of dominating people. And so I think when you go looking in these texts, you can find these kinds of passages. Another one along these lines would be in the 5th chapter of the Political Treatise, where Spinoza talks about tyrannical governments that turn society into a wasteland and a desert rather than a place fit for human habitation, because they crush spirits. Right? Rather than building up minds and creating genuine bonds, they smash everything into pieces, and people just want to, like, save their own skins. That they're just trying to get by. Similar thing in TTP5. So there are all these places in Spinoza where, if you look carefully, you can find models of the sort of interaction he values.
Yeah, of course, because of course it is the logic of utility that he inherits from Hobbes, changing its sign on the opposite ground of Hobbes, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is, you can see he's interested in building social unities. He's interested in enhancing, the lives of the members of those unities. He, unlike Hobbes, he's extremely averse to force and violence.
Yes, of course.
Right. So he's looking for other ways, and you know, if you look in the 5th chapter of the Theological Political Treatise, where he's clearly recalling Hobbes's arguments for the social contract, you can see he parts ways on the question of, you know, threatening people into it, and goes to some lengths to say that really backfires.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, the turning point is, as you said before, the role of the apostles, than the role of Moses, because Moses is a legislator, a leader, and the apostles and Paul spoke as a philosopher. So he needs to.
Although, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, I think there's a bit of a problem with the apostles. They do teach. On the other hand, they end up disagreeing about a lot of important things.
Yeah,
And you might
of course.
think, well,
James and Peter.
Yeah, right. So you might think, well, that's because they have freedom and people come to different conclusions. Another way to read that is that the premises they start from are not intellectually clear. Each one starts from his own opinion, you know, or what he imagines or kind of generally thinks the world is like. And then they apply the tools of reasoning, but because the starting point is defective, of course they don't end up agreeing. So they're not really philosophers.
They act like philosopher.
Yeah. So, you know, and I mean, you know, if you think about the ethics, you need those intellectually known definitions. I mean, if you're starting from merely imaginative concepts, well, the old maxim, garbage in, garbage out, you know. So there's always this debate, like, are the premises intellectually known or are they merely conventional?
Yeah.
The other thing, just to come back to the Machiavellian point, since you're working in Italian, of course, you know the great work of Vittorio Morfino.
Of course.
And Lucchese also. These are, you know, such important books. There is a kind of connection for like Renaissance Averroistic Jewish philosophy and Machiavellianism, right? They're all in this mix. And we really don't know enough about that kind of philosophy and Spinoza's access to it. This is an area that
a
needs
gray
to be
area,
more explored. All these intermediate Averroistic thinkers working from the Jewish side and the Latin tradition, that needs a lot more investigation. You know, the slowly we're filling out, you know, pieces of the puzzle. And certainly, I mean, the other thing I would say is there have been, until recently, you know, kind of almost different national traditions of Spinoza scholarship. Like the way, if you look at, you know, major works in the French literature or major works in English or major works in Italian, you can see people have prioritized different things and they've been reading from different contexts. And one of the things we're now able to do is all get together and think about these things in a more unified way. And I mean, this is kind of the glory of online seminars.
Yeah, we are a great sisterhood and brotherhood of Spinoza.
Yeah, I had the amazing opportunity to talk with Spinoza scholars in Buenos Aires. You know, and Spinoza's political philosophy looks different, right, from that political history. So I think it's still quite important for us to have a sense of where we're reading from and what we bring to the text.
Yeah, of course, I totally agree. Thank you, Julie, for your availability.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah, of course.
So you're reading all these works about education. What impact does it have on your practice as a teacher?
Yeah, maybe it's just the The will of not prioritize authority over a common ground of working together. I see myself as a part of the classroom instead of the top of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
maybe I exaggerate a little bit this this other part. I have no leadership ability. I am a little bit too friendly with my students. But I don't know, Marta, if you have the same problem.
I had the same problem. Now I'm trying to setting some lines, actually, some boundaries. Yeah, because I also noticed that sometimes they require it. I mean, for guidance.
Yeah, I mean, like think about how Spinoza talks about the guidance of reason. Right? Living ex ductu rationis. I mean, like somebody has to provide that. It has to come from somewhere. It doesn't always naturally bubble up for everybody. So, yeah, I find it just really interesting to write about some of these theoretical issues, and explore these texts, and then go to class and think, what am I going to do today?
Yeah, it's a wonderful and challenging connection between being a Spinoza scholar and being a freshman person teacher. It's a wonderful task.
Yeah. All right, and navigating institutions that neither we nor Spinoza designed.
Yeah. And Spinoza, we must say, it was a little bit too harsh with Casearius, with his own students, maybe.
Yeah, but none of us met the man, so
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
hard to say what the expectations were.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to answer more questions, but I also know it's late in the day for you.
We are going to free you from our questions, and thank you so much. It was a really nice talk as friend, I might say.
Oh, well, it's really delightful to meet you. And I'll send you a few things.
Please.
And if you're writing about this, you could send things to me.
Thank you. Of course.
That would be great.
Of course.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie, and
So have a nice day for you.
Yeah, have a nice day.
Yes, and have a good evening for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.